So SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey has said that he might like to see the NCAA tournament expand. Not definitely, but maybe. Thinks it's something that should be studied and considered. His argument seems mostly rooted in the idea that some first four teams, otherwise known as the teams that were the last to get at-large bids, have actually made it all the way to the Final Four. VCU, UCLA. He mentioned Ole Miss in baseball being the last team in the field and going on to win the 2022 College World Series. So his thought process seems to be, listen, we're supposed to be building a bracket that includes every realistic possible national champion. And if we've got teams going from the first four all the way to the Final Four, are we cutting? Is the cut line too low? Should instead of having 68, should it be 80 or some other number? Are we, by cutting it where we're cutting it, actually cutting a championship contender? Let's just keep it simple. I'll ask you, do you think we need to expand the NCAA tournament?
Well, I think there's a couple different, kind of arenas to consider this from. Are we going to consider the argument he made and the ramifications of that, or are we going to consider the primary factor, which is the economics of the NCAA tournament? Because the NCAA tournament, from a financial perspective, is far and away the best thing that the NCAA does. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but that to me is so the economics of it, regardless of the theoretical, like, hey, if VCU wasn't in the first four, or whatever the case may be, they couldn't make their run. That's not going to matter if it's bad for business. And if we've learned anything in recent years, it's what's good for business is going to happen. So from a purist basketball perspective, I would say this: the more teams you have in earlier, the more possibilities for opening weekend upsets make for good TV and good ratings. The flip side of that coin is, by the end of the NCAA tournament, it makes for bad TV and bad ratings, because I think like everybody was, St. Peter's, Cinderella was dancing and everybody was fascinated to watch that Kentucky game. I'm not sure people were quite as interested or would have been interested in watching that in the semifinals. I think the semifinals, people want to see the Blue Bloods and they want to see those matchups, and that's the must-see TV. So I think from that perspective, what would be interesting is if they expanded it, if they did something similar to what we've seen in the conference tournaments where you have a bye system or a double bye system or whatever. Now, the problem with that is that it takes away some of those potential upsets that are what the NCAA tournament is all about. So you've really got a lot of variables to consider there. Again, to me, it's just going to be all about, what's going to make the most sense from a business standpoint, because that is what this is all about.
Yeah, from a business perspective, it goes without saying, the more games you have, the more inventory you have, the more money that's worth. So a bigger NCAA tournament is undeniably worth more money. I push back on Greg's idea that at 68, we're not including all the legitimate championship contenders, because just because VCU went from the first four to the Final Four, same for UCLA, it's not like we have an example of one of those schools actually winning the NCAA tournament. They both lost when they got to the Final Four. This is a very simple observation, but it's something a coach said one time, and it's always stuck with me. Like, the thing about being a Cinderella or even a first four team and getting to the Final Four is that you're still 2 wins away over teams that are better than you before you're the national champion. It's wildly unlikely to happen. And you're exactly right. Like those St. Peter stories, George Mason stories are obviously great when they happen in some ways, but they often end like, do you remember what St. Peter's last game was? They got smashed. They just got bombed out of the tournament. Eventually, the talent discrepancy often catches up with those teams. Like, if I remember correctly, Florida Gulf Coast wins 2 and then gets bombed. St. Peter's wins a few and then gets bombed. When those teams get eliminated, it is often in lopsided games. And from talking to network executives about this over the years, the truth is the NCAA tournament is enhanced by the little guys being in there, because you do get that St. Peter's story, Dunk City story. Those are great, but they're not great. Like the George Mason story from a television perspective is not great. What you want as a television executive is George Mason win 2 games, but then you got to go.
And don't beat a blue blood either.
Yes,
right. Don't take away our heavy hitters for the Final Four. You want to beat like a normal high major without a huge fan base, great. But please don't beat Kentucky, Duke, North Carolina, UCLA, whatever.
But for television, the worst nightmare is a George Mason in the Final Four. Mm-hmm. George Mason winning a game or 2, that's fun. That's awesome. George Mason in the Final Four, that is, that's a nightmare. And so I guess I would argue that it's a sliding scale. If you expand, you get more postseason games. That's fun, but it really makes it, I don't think you're putting more championship contenders in as much as you're putting more mediocre teams in. I've long contended, as somebody who looks at this stuff every day during the season and sometimes struggles to find 26 teams to call to deem rankable in a traditional sense. If you actually look at the last at-large bids, you're picking between some really flawed basketball teams, some teams that have really, maybe they were playing better at the end of the year, but boy, at some point they did some super damage to their resume. Otherwise they wouldn't be in this position. So you leave it up to me. I'd keep it at 68. I'd be more interested in going back to 64 than going up to say 80. But I do understand the economics of it. And if ultimately we get to that place, I won't rant and rave too much about it. The only thing that I think, I don't want to say it's a non-starter, but I think would actually take away from what is special about the NCAA tournament is if they ever went to no automatic bids and there was no path for a Southern Conference champion or an Atlantic Sun champion, because that ensures the St. Peter story that we all fell in love with is impossible. You can never, ever have that again. And the Butler story, back-to-back national title games, impossible. Like you'd never have that again. I hope we never go to that place. Again, if we do, it'll be because of economics. You can just divide it between a few power conferences and leave the so-called little guys out. I think that really damages the product. I wouldn't want to go there, but if we expanded, keep it as is, but just add more slots to the bracket, I guess I can live with that. It's not what I would prefer, but I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world.
I feel like when we opened up, the first 4, we opened up to this line of discussion because it's kind of like, you broke the seal. So where does the water stop running? But like, I go to I know we're not allowed to fill out brackets, and stuff like that. But when I have friends and family who do their bracket and they show it to me, I'm like, oh, what are you doing for the first 4? And they're like, oh, it doesn't even matter. Right. Bracket. And that's like for most college basketball, for the casual college basketball fan who aren't glued to their TV on a Saturday afternoon in late November. That's what the NCAA tournament is. And that's 64 team field. So What does it do to the perception of that to the masses? Because it's the perception to the masses that the economics are really dependent on. And I think, and people who don't watch college basketball, to your previous point, they'll turn on St. Peter's when they're making that run. They are not going to turn on Oregon State versus Florida State. Right. Like if they're just not. That's no different from, a game that may be on that Saturday in November or December. And so I think like they've got to figure out a way to, and maybe the best answer is where we're at now, but obviously college basketball, the NCAA in general, is all about maxing out the bottom line right now. If increasing the tournament is the way to do that, I think they need to do it in a way in which that they preserve the importance of those 64 teams. You want to make it first 8, first 12, whatever. But you preserve the importance of those 64 teams because that is what the masses are really interested in.
There's no question. Like, and I think we're getting away from this on some level because for the same reasons people don't hold newspapers anymore as much as they read newspapers on their phone or their computer. 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a bracket on it. That's not nearly as much of a thing as it was, say, 20 years ago, but it's still a thing. People
Everybody's just clicking it now instead of writing it in.
Right, but people still like that bracket with 64 in it looks perfect. It's easy to digest. It's easy to follow. It's something people have grown up with. And again, we can adapt. We've adapted in the NFL and Major League Baseball and everywhere else. But I'd keep it closer to where it is now, for that reason and a lot of other reasons than going up to 80. Again, I don't think it would. And I'm just throwing 80 out as a possible number. You could even go bigger or smaller, whatever.
There's also just like pragmatic considerations in terms of, like, if you've ever talked to the teams that have played in the first floor, they find out on Sunday, they've got to jump on a flight right then and there. They fly to Dayton, then they're, and their next game is not in Dayton, by the way.
Right.
Then they've got to go somewhere else. And it's I mean, listen, the logistics aren't going to be the reason why somebody says no to a good business plan, but it's got to be a consideration as well.